Hello and welcome to the 24th Annual Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit organization housed within Eastern Washington University. Our program is responsible for Get Lit, Washington State's longest-running annual literary festival, which hosts readings, writing workshops, craft classes, panel discussions, and much more. This year, we're excited to be hosting in-person events taking place this Thursday through Sunday, April 21st through 24th, in many venues across downtown Spokane. And of course, we're very happy to be back with you in this virtual space as well. You can find a full schedule of in-person and virtual events, along with information about all of our festival authors, by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to introduce Luke Lineberger, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator, who will introduce today's event.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Today, I would like to welcome you to Writing Sex Scenes, the art of intimate prose. As authors, we often write about the human experience, and that includes sex. The topic can be awkward. Many of us have struggled with writing about sex, but this panel will help us understand how to present this vulnerable human interaction in our writing in a way that captures the awkwardness, the pleasure, and the sexiness in a totally believable manner for the readers. The 5 talented writers on the panel today will bring fresh perspectives to a typically off-limits topic. We would like to start by introducing you to today's writers, and then we will hand it over to them to get the conversation started. Birkett Morris is the author of Lost Girls, a collection of short stories called A Varied Set of Tales from a Skilled Practitioner of the Short Form by Kirkus Reviews. Her fiction has appeared in Shenandoah, Antioch Review, Notre Dame Review, South Carolina Review, and Santa Fe Literary Review, among other journals. She is a winner of the Bevel Summers Prize for Short Fiction. Morris is also a recipient of a 2013 Al Smith Fellowship from the Kentucky Arts Council.
Liv Arnold has worked as a copywriter for several global companies and now runs her own freelance business. She grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and lives with her husband and their spoiled dog who only eats fresh cooked meals. When she's not writing, Liv's avoiding the gym, devouring a cheese platter, or marathoning way too much TV. And of course, she's a massive book addict and often reads until all hours of the night.
Raised in the Detroit suburbs, Eliza Nellums now lives with her cat in Washington, D.C. She is a member of Bethesda Writer Center, as well as the Metro Writers, a weekly critique group that meets in DuPont Circle. All That's Bright and Gone is her debut novel.
Leah Konen is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she studied journalism and English literature. She is the author of the forthcoming thriller, The Perfect Escape. Her debut thriller, All the Broken People, was a Rolling Stone, Marie Claire, She Reads, and Charlotte Observer Best Summer Book Pick, and was featured in the Reese Witherspoon Hello Sunshine newsletter. She's also the author of several young adult novels, including Love and Other Train Wrecks and The Romantics. She lives in Brooklyn and Saugerties, New York, with her husband, their daughter, Eleanor, and their dog, Farley.
Amanda Brainerd is a New York City real estate broker, wife, and mother of 3. She graduated from Harvard College and earned a Master of Architecture from Columbia University after being expelled from Choate Rosemary Hall boarding school in the 10th grade. Age of Consent is her first novel and was nominated for Best Sex Scene and Best Cover by the Zibby Awards. Amanda will be moderating today's conversation. So Amanda, we'll now hand it over to you.
Thank you guys for having us. We're all really excited to be here. And we're excited to talk about awkward topics and writing sex scenes. So we came up with this idea for the panel because we've all struggled with writing sex scenes. And I have a very brief anecdote, and then I'll start asking everyone some questions, which is, when I was finally turning in my draft to my agent to send my book out to try to sell it, I called my friend Deb Kopakin, who's an author, and I said, I have this sex scene that I have to write, and I absolutely can't write it, and I need you to do it for me. And she's like, I'm on a deadline. I can't do it. You got to do it. And I was like, okay, fine. I just have to write it. I just have to write it. And I wrote it. And then when I went in to meet with Viking, the first thing they said was, I can't believe how well you write sex scenes. And my agent and I were kicking each other under the table. But I think it just illustrates how horrible and grueling I found sex scene writing, and how I don't know about the rest of you, we'll find out how bad it was for all of you. But I guess I want to open up the question to all of my fellow authors. about what makes a good sex scene. And maybe we could start with Leah.
Yes. So what makes a good sex scene? So I have a lot of experience writing sex scenes because I wrote YA novels before adult, and contrary to what you might think, there actually is definitely can be sex in contemporary YA, and it's especially when you're writing. I was writing coming of age stories. A lot of times it does kind of play a big part of a novel. So I've been there multiple times, and I like personally, I think what you really want is to balance interior thinking with what's actually kind of happening on the page, because I think if you spend too much time like really describing, obviously body parts or anything like that, it definitely starts to either feel clinical or feel like something that should be in Hustler or something, which I don't think we want either. So I think it's kind of a balance of giving enough details for the readers to know, have a decent idea of what is physically happening and be able to picture it, without totally, doing a fade to black kind of situation, but also really grounding it in what the character's experiencing and their emotions, because that to me is what is going to take it beyond feeling like, we are just like clinically describing, this happens and this happens and this happens.
I'll jump in on
What do
that
you think?
if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I had the opportunity to write an article for Crime Reads, a blog about sex scenes. So I got to interview other authors about it. And one of my questions was, how do you know if you're doing it correctly? Not sex, but writing sex scenes. And a lot of them had a similar comment around it being a defining moment plot-wise in the story, so that you're not writing something that's just just for sheer pleasure. Not that there's anything wrong in that, but these were mystery writers, and their point was it should be a plot point. It should be revealing something about character or relationship or setting up a future piece that's going to pay off later. And that's how you can tell you're not being too gratuitous, which is something I think about a lot. If there's no reason for the action to be occurring on the screen in the plot, maybe you don't need to be explicit. Or if there is a very explicit point that you're trying to make, that can lead how much detail you go into or how much appears on the page.
Liv, what do you think? Or Ellen, either of you?
Okay, I'll jump in if that's okay. I was going to say there are just two different things that I think about with sex scenes. It's good if there's some tension that's involved that's sort of above and beyond the tension of what's happening between the two people. So I have a as yet unpublished novel called Mapping the Sky, where there's a love triangle, which immediately adds tension to what's going on. The other thing I love to do with sex scenes is add humor. And I've got a couple of little brief examples, if you don't mind me sharing those. I've got with that same novel, Mapping the Sky, these two people are, they're fellows in an astronomy program in Hawaii. They meet at the initial meeting. They go back to this guy's apartment to have sex, and he's got one of these mobiles that has all the planets above it, right above the bed. And so they're in the middle of the act of having sex, and the woman rears back and she just sends the planets spinning. And so he says, the guy says to her, I think we just destroyed all those romantic metaphors around the moon and the stars. And she looks at him and she says, Emily Freeman, metaphor buster, glad to meet you. And at this point she's straddling him. I mean, it's clear they've met before, but it's fun to kind of add those elements of humor in there as well.
Liv, what do you think makes a good sex scene?
Well, I write romance, so sex scenes does come up quite a bit because my predominant goal is writing about people falling in love, and sex scenes happens to be a part of that. And I think the main thing is it has to move the story forward. So each scene, it will have to show different characteristics of the characters and show their character growth. But while we're writing romance, so sometimes I first thought, how many ways can you really write people having sex? Like I was thinking, like it can get difficult to come up with new ideas. So I do Google ideas sometimes, and sometimes Google is a very lightening experience. Like when I'm looking up different positions, sometimes I'm thinking, what's the pinball wizard, or what's the leapfrog? And like Google comes up with a lot of more and more strange positions.
So
We're
Liv,
all
you must
immediately
get-
on Amazon downloading all of Liv's books.
Yeah, and also, Liv, I want to just add that you must get unbelievable, fantastic advertising and spam sent to you as a result of these Google searches.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of writers, like when they do research things, like, and if police officers ever look up their search history, they'll probably think they're a bit crazy.
So
Yeah,
do
as
you
a
want
crime writer, I can say that's definitely true. You're Googling how long it takes to kill somebody or how to do it. Oops, hi FBI.
So why don't we get down and dirty and maybe have one of you tell us a little bit about, just give us a little bit of a framework for the scene that you're about to read to us, and maybe we can just start with Liv since she's unmuted, and maybe if you're up for that, just give us a little tiny background and then read us a scene. Maybe read us the leapfrog scene. No, just kidding. Whatever you'd like.
Okay, so with this scene, so I try to think of real issues with the characters. So the male character has anxiety and depression and PTSD from being in the army life, and the woman, she feels like she's lost control because of she's now a single mom, and now her and her husband are looking at reuniting, and they sort of experiment with BDSM, but I try to put a bit of light humor into it. So I can read a passage off of that. But at the end, I do try to put a bit of humor into it, just so that, because I guess sex is funny. So, and a lot of people, when you are reading out sex scenes, they can't help but giggle a little bit. So sometimes I think may as well just make the most of it. So this is when they sort of experiment with two cool metal balls that she gets from the sex shop. Yeah, so I'll just start from that. Okay. And just tell me if it gets a bit too explicit, I guess. Smirking, he strode to her. Ready? Gasping, she nodded. He slithered the two cool balls deep inside her head. Hips up, she clenched the metal hard. The ball stretched her out. His mouth glided over her folds, her pubic bone across her hip. He licked her clit with a firm drag of his tongue. Jenna hissed. The balls massaged her internal walls. Her head tilted back. She was close, too close. His tongue swirled, rounded around, and he nipped the tip of her clit. The walls of her pussy trembled. He licked her with his flattened tongue, forcing her inhibitions away. Her body jerked. She strained to grab his head, but those damn ropes tortured her again. Frustration added to her need. She clutched onto the strings, chafing her skin. He sucked on her for several long seconds. Her mind grew woozy. She saw tremors overtook her, too overcome with pleasure and pain. Her legs shook. The balls tensed her stomach muscles, heightening every touch and sensation. Her body dissolved into jelly. I need to be inside you. He crawled up and kissed her mouth, tasting like whipped cream and her arousal. God, yes, the air left her lungs. She wanted to feel him, all of him. Let me remove these first. He shuffled lower and slid his finger inside her. A few beats passed. Her orgasmic dizziness slowed. She lifted her head. What's taking you so long? His voice croaked. I can't find it. Ha, 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 very funny. No, I'm serious. The string or stick thingy that connected the balls fell off. He held up a silver thread. It can't be lost in there. Untie me. Where did you buy this from? It snapped off so easily. He removed the ropes from her hands and feet, rubbing the little red indents each time. The adult shop's bargain bin nearby my work. Jenna had never guessed an accident could happen skipping on a sex toy. Most normal people assumes the word discounted meant newer stock was arriving. She sat up straight, inserting her finger. Her fingertips grazed the metal. They could not grasp and pull it out. Sweat beads formed in her hairlines. Her skin flushed. Marco kneeled at her entrance. Let me help. We don't need multiple sets of fingers in here. Panting, she knocked his hand away. Her face radiated heat like a furnace. Slumping, she took deep breaths past a mirror. He hurried to the ensuite bathroom. Seconds later, he held a small compact mirror. She snatched it, angled the glass, and hunched her back. No sign of silver. He lingered at the edge of the bed. Are you okay? A sex toy stuck in my vagina. What do you think? From her reflection, her face glowed bright red. She puffed, unable to steady her breaths. Her muscles hurt. The more she attempted to remove, the more the object shoved further up. He left the room. She squatted and squeezed, but the balls didn't budge. They were supposed to be slick enough to slide out. Served her right for saving money on an item meant to be inside her. Marco returned, holding her wallet and car keys. Where are you going? She tried to retrieve the metal balls again. The room closed in. This wasn't good. He grabbed her clothes. I'm taking you to the nearest hospital emergency room. And so that idea, I'm not sure if you've ever seen this news or this rumor from Australia. There's this popular news reporter that it got a lot of rumors around that she got sent to hospital because she had a champagne bottle stuck up her, and people thought it was insanely funny, and no one knows it was a rumor or actually true, but I thought I'll write about that.
That's excellent. That is
Yeah.
excellent. So I always think, in sex scenes that less is more, but there's a lot of more in that scene and it really works. But it is very funny. I mean, it's great. It's really good.
I think that's a great point though, that like it really depends on what tone you're going for. So since it's all about humor, the more is more kind of works, like because it's like so much that it doesn't put us in that super sexy kind of state of mind, because we are going for comedy. And I think that's why it always comes down to like kind of where you are with the tone.
Leah, do you want to tell us about one of your scenes while you're on?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, compared to that, I feel like mine's not even a sex scene. Like it's so not explicit in comparison. But
That's
yeah,
it.
so,
Drop the panel if nothing gets stuck in there.
right. But yeah, so The Perfect Escape, which is actually out now, it is a murder mystery. So definitely a different purpose for this. But one of the main characters, Sam, she's supposed to be on a girls' trip, supposed to be in the Adirondacks. They have gotten stuck on the way to their destination, and she has landed herself accidentally or serendipitously or perhaps intentionally, depending how you want to read it, in the town where her ex-husband lives. And they have not seen each other since he walked out on her for another woman. And while she's like kind of drinking margaritas at a bar with her friends, she runs into Harry, who again she hasn't seen. So this is their I will say a public sex scene in the woods behind the bar. So that is what I have to bring to you. I leaned forward closer to Harry, and in seconds he dropped his beer to the ground, and his other hand was framing my face in that way I'd loved so much. The way that had endeared me bonded me to him from the start. Objections rang through my head. You should have more self-respect than this. He left you, for God's sake. But it didn't matter. We never even got a proper goodbye. Maybe this would be it. Or maybe it would be even more. Harry leaned closer still, and I could nearly taste the whiskey on his breath, and the smell sent me back to those nights we shared together early on, before anything had even happened. The sheer passion, the illicitness of it all. Now he pressed his body against mine. His eyes were so familiar, eyes I'd thought I somehow there, eyes that could still get my knees buckling, my stomach flip-flopping. I let myself take a breath, and then I lifted my chin, the tiniest bit. I hated him for what he'd done, what he'd turned me into, for forcing me to live a lie these last 2 months, too broken, too ashamed to tell the truth to anyone other than Diana and Margaret. Harry sighed, deep and guttural, the sort of sigh of pleasure I'd heard from him many times, Sunday mornings, Tuesday nights, pleasure and pain, hold and release. Then his hands found my hair, his fingers diving through the strands, scraping across my scalp. He pulled me to him, jerked almost, and our mouths came together, hungry and gasping, like coming up for air after holding your breath for so very long, like the first sip of water after a hard workout, the salt on your lips, the rivulets dribbling down your chin. He felt the same. The space where my lips ended and his began was hard to define. Only all of it was more urgent, like time was a thing we were borrowing, tiny bits of sand cascading down to the bottom. My teeth grasping at his lip, my hand dropping to the beer to the ground as I wrapped my arms around him, pulled him closer as liquid spilled across my sandals, seeping into the earth around us, turning it to squishy mud. My back pressed hard against the tree trunk, so hard I wondered if I was scratching Margaret's jacket. And his hands lifted the hem of my dress, and out of the corner of my eyes, I saw the patrons on the patio, but they weren't even looking. We were in the dark, and I didn't give a fuck anyway as I squeezed out of my underwear, letting them drop to the ground. And then, as if neither of us had pushed that forbidden button, as if it had somehow just happened, Harry and I were together again. It was over in minutes, like bad decisions often were.
Great. I mean, that what I love about that is that you don't actually get into any of the real gory details, but yet we can, you rely on the reader to fill in the blanks, and that's so much more powerful than spelling it all out for us.
Yeah, I think for that scene, like the real thing that a reader needed to take away is that she is kind of betraying herself as like as a woman, as someone who has self-respect. Like she's doing the opposite of what she would advise any friend to do. Like this guy treated her poorly, and here she is like literally hooking up with him, in the woods behind a bar. And so I think for me, it's just kind of really rooting it in what's going on in her mind, and also rooting it, I think with sex, what's super interesting is if you're writing a sex scene between people who have had a relationship, every relationship has its own kind of sexual language. So part of it is this nostalgia and this memory and the way that she knows his body and he knows hers, that you almost don't need to go into all those details because this is something that they've done a million times before. What's different now is that this is the first time they've ever had sex where they were not together. And I think so that is what is kind of rising to the top with her.
So Ellen, do you want to tell us a little bit about a scene in your writing? And
Yeah, absolutely. What Leah just said about sexual language, or the language that couples have, for things that involve sort of the way they're connected, really is relevant to the scene I'm going to read. It's a short story from Lost Girls called Harvest, and it's a short story about an older lady who is on a bus, sees her reflection, doesn't like what she sees, covers all the mirrors in her house, and decides she's just not going to look at herself. And, ironically, she's sort of forced to come face to face with herself as an individual and also sexually. And so I've got two different excerpts from different scenes that involve her and a guy she knows. And here we go. On Sundays, Abby visited Tony Conti in the nursing home. She and Tony had gone to school together and had had the same after-school job picking berries at Deems Farm. They had worked side by side, talking as they slipped berries still warm from the sun into their mouths. Once, when a bee stung her, he removed the stinger and placed her finger in his mouth to suck out the venom. She laughed and pushed him away, but never forgot how he looked, his lips around her finger, his eyes closed, his long dark lashes beautiful in the sunlight. Now, I've got a scene that comes a little bit later in the same short story. And she walks into the nursing home and Tony's there and he's saying, "I'm trying to remember what it felt like to be young," he said, a tear rolling down his cheeks. She put her arms around him and turned him until he was facing her. "I can't remember a thing about what it felt like," he said. She looked at his room. It could have been anywhere, a hotel room, a nondescript bedroom of a grown child, but it was the nursing home where Tony would die alone. She held him closer. "It feels like this," Abby said. She took his hand, rough with years of manual labor, spotted with age. She brought it to her lips, slowly kissing every finger and then his palm. She slipped his forefinger into her mouth as he had done for her so many years ago. She realized then that she still felt like a 16-year-old, no matter how much time had passed. His breathing slowed and he rested his head on her shoulder. She thought of them together, warmed by the sun, their heads bent over a field of slowly ripening berries. So it's it's sexual. It's not really sex, but it's very, very sexual. So and it's a language they shared, like Leah mentioned. So
I love it when we get to have some non-traditional characters and their experiences. I feel like if we could redo this panel, we might have had some more like men or queer characters. This is a female perspective on sex. So I'm glad we have some diversity of an older person as well as younger people, and romance as well as mystery. That's so cool.
I think what's really interesting about all three of the ones and we're going to hopefully hear from Eliza next, but each one is totally different, but it tells something about the characters and about the story and about what's happening. And so it's very specific. There's not a sort of generality that you can say, except for they're sexual, but each one is very finely honed to talk about the story that that each of you are trying to tell. So maybe we could hear something from Eliza.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. You know, you could never switch those scenes around between the stories and have them all still work, you know, like, because I guess that's how you know you've done it right. I'll be reading from my book, The Bouquet. This is a book about a woman who's trapped in a hurricane. She refuses to evacuate, and this guy shows up. And I think what's relevant is they haven't really been getting along at all. And for good reason. The character is not really depicted that she's about to sleep with in this scene. No spoilers. He's not really depicted as very admirable or likable. But she's in a really tough situation, and they've just gone through something that nearly killed them, and it's not looking good for their future either. And so this scene occurs, and my goal as I was writing it was sort of to try to avert romantic tropes that I had read in something like a romance novel. This scene is not really intended to be romantic. It's intended more to increase the drama and the tension in the second half of the book. So my main character is Magda, and the guy who's shown up in the storm and is slowly eating out her resources is Hank, and she kind of wishes he had not shown up. But here she is. She'll find a way to make use of him, shall we say. Hank took a step closer and hesitated. Slowly, he reached to slide a hand through her hair. It must be disgusting, she thought briefly. It was sticky with humidity, unwashed for 3 days, still damp with rainwater. She debated moving away. Didn't. Tell me if I'm reading this wrong, won't you? He said, leaning in. This was a mistake, she thought, a distraction. It wasn't love or even lust, but it was something. It spoke to the same part of her that had sat down in the middle of the storm and gotten drunk on the leftover wine. Get undressed, she told him. Your shoes are soaked. Grinning, he kicked out of his shoes, which squelched, and then his sodden socks to reveal pruny, pale feet. Then, still holding her eyes, he shucked out of his belt and let his jeans drop around his ankles, standing in dark gray boxers. His knees, Magda found, were the only part of him that reminded her of her ex, knobby and thin. Something about his helplessness, the innocent way he exposed himself without any shame, tugged at her. Bryce, her ex, had been the same. Never ashamed of his body, but Magda always thought of herself as a secret. Should I keep going? Asked Hank. She took the last daring half step in order to fit into the circle of his arms and lifted her head to kiss him. Because he was warm and she was always cold. Because he was alive, unlike everything else in the house, including maybe even herself. Because he wanted something from her, and what Magda wanted was not to think anymore. He tasted bitter, a hint of tobacco, but fresh like rainwater and ozone. His chin bristled with unshaved hair. It was different from her ex, who had been careful to maintain himself to a certain standard. I have to look good, he had said. No one's going to tip an ugly bartender. But Hank was ungroomed, sweating and dirty, but so was she. He slid his hand down her back and Magda groaned, stepping in to press against his chest. You want to lose a few layers, darling. Come down to my level, he asked. In reply, she shrugged out of her shirt, tossing it over a reproduction captain's chair that was accurate to the period of the house. She bent to untie the laces of her sneakers. His injured hand wasn't bothering her as he helped her to crawl down into his lap. But when he guided her down, she pushed him forward instead. Like this, she whispered. He didn't resist being positioned the way she wanted, the way she preferred it. Maybe in the past she'd been willing to experiment, but Hank was almost a stranger, and strangers mated carefully. I didn't think I had a chance with you, he said, watching her avidly. Well, you're kind of the last man on earth, she said, and he laughed. There was no protection, But Magda was pushing 40 and had taken bigger risks than this. It was appropriate, was authentic to the original era of the house. She didn't have time to locate the intestines of a sheep in the French style. She reached down to line them up. Ah, said Hank, a soft noise of contentment of the kind that Magda would make sinking into her own clean bed after changing the sheets. He tried to thrust up and found himself stymied by her not inconsiderable weight. He needed his hands to hold himself up, and that meant that he couldn't reach for her, couldn't hold on to her in the way he might have otherwise wanted to, or touch her hair or her face. He had to remain still underneath her, except for the restless movement of his hips. Magda began to move slowly. Unbidden, a line of poetry ran through her mind, like the unfeeling bait of the ocean's blood. Darling, said Hank, trying to match as best he could. Beautiful, ain't ya? She didn't need his compliments. She leaned forward to muffle him, and that was sufficient to keep him occupied while she used the strength in her thighs and core until both of them were gasping. And finally his patience snapped, and he came up around her like a trap, his hands on her shoulders, legs pressed up against her, and she reached down to bring herself pleasure before he took his, which was always her goal. It was a different kind of thing from what she'd had in the past, feeling truly connected. This was merely the scratching of an itch, but it had its own charms. This kind of sex was catch as catch can, and she accepted that. Fortunately, he fell back gasping when it was over, and Magda reached once again to free herself from the embrace. She realized too late that her bleeding hands, cut by the paddle, had left streaks of rusty blood over his ribs. She reached to wipe them away with her fingertips. That's the stuff, he slurred. Wish we had a cigarette, huh? Mine are all wet. Magda would never have let him smoke in the historic house.
Very good. Very good. It's so interesting. I mean, I just would love to hear what each of you struggled with in writing these scenes. And I don't know, Eliza, you were saying that you didn't want it to be romantic and you didn't want to sort of fall into the tropes of romance. I think the thing that I've struggled with the most in writing sex scenes is exactly that, which is you have that language in your brain from reading all the stuff we've read. And it's so hard not to rely on cliche and, you know, the language of 50 Shades of Grey, you know, and to make it authentic and make it real. And I really, that scene is very real. But what,
I'll start since I just went. I feel like it was easy for me to write this scene and I didn't struggle with it. I felt like I really wanted this to happen this way. But then after it was over, I totally panicked because I realized people were going to read it. And actually that is a little toned down from the original version, which was more explicit, you know, just physically in terms of what they were doing. And I was completely confident until I was like sending it to my agent, who's like a lovely man who I don't think like really, I just wasn't prepared emotionally to have people that know me read scenes like that were maybe more intimate than I had intended them to be, or more revealing than I had intended them to be. I don't know if anybody else struggles with that.
I definitely had the problem of my daughters not wanting, still to this day, not wanting to read my book because they think there's so much sex in it, which there isn't. There are, in fact, 2 sex scenes, neither of which are particularly sexy. And it's, yeah, I mean, my parents' friends have all read it. My grandparents, you know, I mean, it's just, you put yourself out there in the world and that's what you get.
I feel like a sex scene, you can't help reveal yourself. It's one of those times where even if you don't think you are, you're going to. So now you've got, you know, your great aunt and my father and my cousins reading a scene that even if I planned on making it not be about me, is going to be influenced by my own experience or something.
So one of the things I struggled with was that my book is a coming of age novel and the main character is loosely based on me and everybody knows it, that knows me. And so when there's the sex scene that I'll read it to you if we have time, but between the 15-year-old me and the 15-year-old's teacher at boarding school, everyone's like, did that really happen to you with your teacher? I was like, no, it actually didn't. I made it up. But, you know, still to this day, I think people are like, oh, she had sex with her teacher. So I don't know, Leah, what did you struggle with?
So honestly, like I don't think I have a lot of trouble writing sex scenes. It's not especially like it's not something that like really, really, I struggle with like other elements of a book. I think with this one in particular, a big comment that I had from editors, from beta readers and friends was just how to show a character in a very vulnerable moment where we know she's making kind of the wrong choice, and it might come off as even a pathetic choice. I mean, I don't like to throw judgments on, but that is kind of what the fear was. And so what I struggled was making her feel both very real and honest and vulnerable, but also like someone that we could root for. Because I think we all know probably that, especially writing female characters, they're going to get be really under the microscope when they make bad decisions, quote unquote. So for me, it was much more of a character struggle than I think the actual sex part, which I guess I always think is kind of like fun to write. I think it's just kind of like a fun little thing to write. I don't know. It's exciting.
I
Of
think
course,
what you're saying is really important. It's like you don't want to discredit your heroine or your characters. Well, unless that's your goal, but you don't want to discredit a character that you want the reader to be rooting for and to believe in, and you don't want to disappoint your reader, even if
right.
your character is disappointing herself.
And it was also for this, it was like, how do I even make it believable that she does this with this man who hurt her so badly? And so for that, it wasn't even the sex scene itself. It was, they have this whole drink in the bar before this happens. And basically there's a line right before that I actually didn't read because it wasn't really part of the sex scene, but there's a line where she says outright that she wants him to choose her in this moment, even though she knows it's fleeting and all of that. She wants to be chosen over this other woman, even for a second, because where she is right now, after drinking, after just everything she's been through, she feels like, at least if I can just win in this, then I'll feel some bit of closure. And so I think for me, it was like looking at the scenes before and after and really building it out to make it feel like it all worked with the character.
It's really interesting. And I don't know, Ellen, what did you struggle with in writing that scene?
For me, the struggle is always, and this is sex scenes or any other scene, finding authentic detail that's really specific to the character, something really small. And so in one of the sex scenes that I wrote, this woman, when she's about to orgasm, she sees blue behind her eyes, so it's always for me about what are they experiencing bodily, or what are they noticing in the room that maybe nobody else would notice? What is the small item that connects these people over and above the physical act that they're doing at the time? And so that's it. I mean, I really use those details to ground myself, and I find that it helps. And if I include enough detail, I can always throw some out, but then I've got something to lean on if I need to. So
Can I just say too that I just wanted to add, like, Ellen, I think your sex scene is the one that you would think, it's two older characters. It's kind of the most PG of all the ones we read. And it was almost the sexiest because it's like in this very small interaction, we're kind of experiencing a lifetime of these characters. And there's something so forbidden and alluring about it that I think is just kind of interesting. It really does play to that kind of less of is more idea.
yeah, and I actually had friends who said, "Oh no, you can't have her put his finger in her mouth." Like, sorry, we're going there. It's just going to happen. So
I want to hear from Liv, since you probably write more romance books with more scenes than any of us. I'd like to hear.
Well, there's a stereotype and a stigma that romance is cheesy. and that the people that write it, they're like desperate housewives, or they perform all these weird kinky acts in real life. But when you think about it, no one asks a crime or thriller writer if they've really murdered someone in real life. So it's like a double standard sort of there. But then I just thought, I'll just embrace that. I embrace every single pun. I find that kind of funny. So I guess like with what's hard about writing a sex scene, I would just go with puns and just say, yeah, it's a very hard situation, but I rose to the occasion. So
That's good. That's
Do you
good.
ever wrestle with people in the real world knowing this about you, or encountering your books and, you know, having that reflect?
no one in my family is allowed to read this. Like I just would be mortified if they read it. But then when you think about it, like I think most people, and me included, should be more willing to discuss this and talk about it, because sex is a part of human nature, and romance does make people feel good, and there's a happily ever after, which is what people want as an escape. And yeah, like, so, and also with a lot of romance, the main female character, they take charge of their sexuality, they know what they want, and that's just something that we all deserve. So yeah.
And they always have an orgasm.
Yes. So in my books, it's all about the female. It doesn't really matter if the guy orgasms or not.
So I was, I would love to read you guys the scene, this short scene between Eve, the 15-year-old 10th grader, and her teacher, that I struggled with enormously, because first of all, just the very fact of a totally innocent girl who's really, so, you know, we've talked a little bit, we sort of skirted around empowerment and holding the power, whether or not the female holds the power in the sex scene. And I wanted this character to feel like so many young women feel, that she wasn't a victim, that she wanted this. And in fact, in the novel, she does want it. I mean, wants sexual experiences. 10th grade and 11th grade boys are clueless, and she turns to a flirtatious older man because she thinks that here I'm going to actually get an experienced lover and who knows what they're doing. And, you know, I think I've gotten a lot of people look at this, my novel, and the stuff that happens to these young women and say they were raped, they were taken advantage of. And I understand that there's a problem with a 15-year-old girl having a sexual encounter with her teacher. I get it. But I felt very strongly that she held the power, even if she believed she held the power, even if she really didn't. So Eve knocked on Mr. Winkler's door just before supper. He opened it and grinned. I hoped you might stop by. Is it a bad time? It occurred to her that another girl might be there. She peered past him, but could see no one. Not at all. I'm glad to see you. Come in, he said, standing aside in mock chivalry. She entered and he took her coat. Can I offer you something? He asked. What's available? She looked up at him. Anything your heart desires, he said, and his eyes swept over her, taking her in. Eve relaxed a bit. Tyranny or not, he was still interested in her. Bourbon? Coming right up. He walked into the kitchen. The portrait of some old headmaster stared down at her from above the mantel. A log shifted and sparks flew up the chimney. Mr. Winkler handed her the drink and she sat on the sofa. He was only a few inches away. What an ordeal you've been through, he said. How are you holding up? Okay, I guess. She took a slug of bourbon. It burned her throat. They looked at each other. As if in slow motion, her teacher reached out and gently took the glass from her hand. He set it on the table, where one of the ice cubes fell onto the other with a clink. Eve was frozen in a film still, but Mr. Winkler was moving, leaning toward her, and then he was kissing her. She couldn't believe it. It was actually happening. In a moment, she started to kiss him back, hoping she was doing it right. Eve was aware of her teacher's hand on her back, the smell of wood smoke, his corduroy knee. He was excellent, she thought, smooth. This must be the way a man kissed. How had she waited so long? Her teacher's hand moved under her shirt, across her bra, his fingers cool from the glass as he caressed the nylon. Eve kept her eyes tightly shut. Mr. Winkler eased her onto her back, leaning his weight against her side. His fingers slipped beneath her waistband. She tensed. Hush, he whispered, like a lullaby at bedtime. His hand on her hip bone across her stomach, then into her underpants. Eve willed herself not to move, not to act like this was unusual. Should she be doing something to him? His fingers were inside her. She tried to focus on the kissing, keep things up there, but as he kept at it, she stopped caring. She couldn't worry anymore. Eve's head fell back, lips apart, but at the last moment, she covered her mouth and masked her cry as a cough. That's all. So I just, I feel like she, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what you guys think about power dynamics in sex scenes, but I think it's a worthy conversation.
Well, it must be, I mean,
oh, sorry, you go, Leah.
I was just going to say, so your book is, I mean, called Age of Consent. So like you must be, you're playing with what, what is consent, right? Because she can think she's wanting something, and then we can also take a step back and know that, with the power imbalance, there is really no way for her to consent. But then at the same time, that might not be what she feels, and it's obviously not what she feels based on what you've just read. So I guess my question for you is kind of like, do you think that balancing the consent element, do you think that's part of what made it so scary for you to write this scene?
I was going to add to that. This is the scene that you were talking about that you wrote like right at the end and we're stressed out about, right? Yeah. Okay, cool. That's interesting to hear.
I just, I wanted to make it real, but I also, the consent thing is really complicated. I mean, it's, she's 15 years old. Like, how much consent could she actually have? But yet she has been thinking about hoping that something will happen with her teacher for weeks. And finally, something does. And actually, it's relatively minor. And I won't spoil what happens later in the book. But I mean, the book is not about, the book is about girls struggling to come of age and navigate and figure out how to retain power for themselves and move into adulthood when they really are still children. But I think most people, look, if this were my daughter, I would say she absolutely was assaulted. She didn't give consent. But I remember very distinctly at the time that I was that age, wanting desperately to have sexual experiences and not understanding that if I had them with an older guy, that it was wrong. I was like, of course he would desire me. I'm hot. I mean, it just seemed at the time in my life that I was not a victim, that I was a willing participant. And, I mean, I was lucky that nothing really terrible happened to me, and it happened to plenty of other girls. But, I think part of the complication in this scene is that she really isn't old enough to consent, but she thinks she is. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, and what you did so well was you had us in her head. So we knew exactly how foreign these feelings were to her, and the fact that she disguised her orgasm with a cough. I mean, you really put us in her body in a way that let us know exactly what this felt like for her. And that's why I think it worked so well.
But I do think it's, we could, it's just, it's sort of what Leah was kind of trying to do, which is obviously, showing a character making a bad decision, but making that decision willingly.
I like how in your book, in her head, she's still calling him Mr. Winkler. So it does show that power dynamic.
That's true.
When he says hush, and she has this kind of like almost father figure reaction. Like, I think you said hush, like saying goodnight or a bedtime story. I forgot.
Lullaby at bedtime.
But and I think that is like ways. I think that's really interesting because I think it kind of poses an interesting question about sex scenes in general. It's like we could show a character who wants something, but maybe still is not able to consent. And I think like you layered things in there that show that there is that power dynamic, even if she's in it and she wants it.
Yeah, I think all the scenes do a good job of revealing the characters involved, regardless of how you could feel about the foreground action. I think that was the challenge that we were all trying to meet, is to have not just a general sex scene that you could drop anywhere in the book, but that is occurring at this time to this character, and that they're experiencing it the exact way that they would at that time, which is difficult to get like that deeply into the character's experience. But that's, I think, the goal, no matter what the genre or what's going on.
I wanted to ask Liv a
If-
question.
yeah.
Go ahead. Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry,
Liv.
I was going to say with romance, it's a little bit different because consent always has to be there, whether it's verbal, like it has to be a big resounding yes. So there shouldn't be any hesitation, and I think like that's part of the Me Too movement, to make sure that there is that consent there. And not only that, like romance writers do have that responsibility to make sure that there's proper protection. So you do have to write in that condom scene, or just even like a brief line about the pill or something like that.
That's
I
so
would say that when I was writing sex scenes in my YA novels, I had a completely different like set of metrics that I felt that I needed to get across, because literally children will be reading it. So I always had mentions of protection, like usually condoms, just because not all minors have access to the pill. And I don't think it, like, I was writing kind of a different genre than like, a happy romance always. So like there wasn't always an enthusiastic consent, but if there wasn't, it was very, very clear that was wrong. And I think it is interesting because depending on how you are writing it and who you're writing it for and what kind of tone you're putting out with it, it really changes what you need to put into it and what you need to, for me, it was always like, I cannot handle even one teen walking away from any of my books thinking it's cool to have sex without protection. So even if it felt a tiny bit awkward, for me, it was like, that was just a line that I was unwilling to cross. And I think we kind of all have those parameters depending on the scene we're writing and depending on who we're writing for.
I love that, because I feel like romance novels, especially the sex, is somewhat aspirational a lot of times. Like, it's idealized sex. Like everyone always has an orgasm, multiple orgasms every time, even in your first encounter. So to add things like condoms or consent or explicit negotiations to those scenes while still having them be aspirational is so powerful. Where if you're not writing an aspirational scene, then it might be a little different. But I think that's cool that that's a goal of the genre.
I think one of the things that I noticed in Eliza's scene is one of the questions that I wanted to sort of discuss, which is, and we've sort of answered it to a certain degree, but do you think a sex scene has to be hot in order to be successful?
I hope not, because that one's not that hot. Also, immediately after that scene, she pees, which was really important to me. I just wanted to have like a true, like, what is it like for women? Well, one thing is that when she's done having sex, she has to pee immediately.
Was that your PSA against UTIs?
Yes, it's a PSA.
Like,
thank you. Yes.
Please don't get a UTI.
Yeah.
Especially during a hurricane when you can't get to a
right. Can't get
doctor,
condoms,
like,
and also you're not going to have
dealing with that.
Cranberry juice or any of those situations. You're going to need to take care.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
But she does seem to have quite a bit of the power in that. I mean, just by the fact that she's on top, but also she seems to be
she does in that
and
scene.
stronger.
Yeah, but the book itself is a bit about like male violence, and aggression is a thriller as well as a mystery. There's a lot of murders going on in the background. So she has the power in that scene, but I don't think that she is always able to maintain that with Hank specifically, who becomes more of an antagonist actually over time.
What I loved actually about your scene is that she spends almost as much time thinking about and describing her ex as she does thinking about and describing the person she's actually sleeping with. And I think that to me is so fascinating. Like when we were talking about like what makes a good sex scene and how much is too much and too little, like I still always come back to like the interiority, because that is where you're really learning what the character is. And what we pull from your scene is that she's getting something very specific out of like from it, and that she still has feelings, however complicated they may be, around her ex. And you know, we don't even need to know any of the backstory to just know that from that one scene.
I also think that in Ellen's scene, you know, which was really beautiful, those two snippets she read were really beautiful, you know, that they're sensual rather than, you know, I mean, you were saying they were very sexual, but I think they're more sensual. And, you know, you know, the sort of oblique reference to the warm berries is clearly a sexual reference, but, you know, you can fit things in that are extraneous details. I also love in Eliza's the period details that she's constantly harping on in the historic home while she's having sex.
That character is a historian, so she's kind of obsessed with the historical accuracy of the house she's having sex with. But in Leah's scene also, I noticed, I think it's the wet squishy mud, and I was like, okay, well, that's a way of revealing
the sandals. But
yeah.
So Liv, does she ever get the balls out of her vagina?
Yeah, God, Liv, I had to know.
What happens? I'm dying to know.
Yeah, she does. She goes to the hospital room and the doctor has to remove it. And so even that whole scene, it's a big joke and there's a lot of puns in there. And I think sometimes life is stranger than fiction. And like I said, it happened, well, it was rumored to happen to this news reporter. And I think that not all sex scenes have to be hot. Like sex can be awkward. Like if you try to take each other's clothes off, something might get caught on your necklace or something like that. So it's important to show that realism there.
It's true.
You know, in that, I was going to say that same character that I told you about, the older lady, I did have an earlier scene where she thinks back to when she loses her virginity in a car with a football player who's like overly appreciative and has a lisp and says, thanks, thanks, thanks. And she always thought of him as Tanks after that. And he had given her roses. And the next morning she goes out to the car and there are just crushed roses everywhere. So the power of objects to sort of stand in for, you know, her virginity, the crushed roses, you know, there's so much we can play with there. It's really fun.
I feel like what we're doing here is reclaiming these sex scenes from the female point of view, because I think we've all read these James Bond sex scenes where, you know, he bangs the girl with the booby boobs and it's all about the knockers or whatever, and you get 5 minutes of that and like it's not even clear what's going on in her mind. And all of us here are trying to write a more realistic female gaze oriented scene. I mean, romance is often female gaze oriented, which is what I love about it. But like, I did dream that some guy who had read a James Bond book right before mine would read my scene and be like, ew, wait, that's what they're thinking? They're comparing me to her ex and thinking about my knobby knees and how it's like not the best she's ever had. And I'm like, yes, but then she has to pee. So like, I think it's cool that we all did that in this panel. That's awesome.
Vis-a-vis the James Bond analogy, my husband and I have been listening to the James Bond books on audio and on our drives up to Connecticut on the weekends. And they are, first of all, I am shockingly well written, but the sex part and the description of the women is literally eye rolling. I mean, I feel like Ian Fleming, just no offense to him, because I really was impressed by his writing, but I mean, and a pair of magnificent breasts. I mean, is that really what men think? I don't actually even think men think that way. I don't know. We should, for the next panel, we'll have all male authors and talk to them about writing sex scenes.
I think we've heard plenty from them. I think it's okay. We don't need to hear from them. I'm good with that. I'm
starting my new career as like a sexpert, and my male writer friends are bringing me their sex scenes now to have me read them as women. A lot of my male friends are writing female points of view and then they have a scene in it. And so they're like, I'm going to need basically a sensitivity reader that's like me now because of this panel and because I did the article and a few other things. Like, this is totally my niche. I love it. I'm going to do it all the time.
It's such an honor, Eliza. If you need a second opinion, you can send it.
Yes, I will call everybody on this panel and we'll all have some things to say that are the same and some things that are different.
I think the big takeaway from this panel, though, I have to say, if we could just sum it up, is not to cheap out on sex toys per that amazing scene. I mean, I think that's that is really the moral here.
100%.
That is the moral.
You get what you pay for.
That is true.
Well, I
And
think we've had a really great time, and I love talking to all of you. I think we, covered a lot of ground and really got into the weeds, which I think is what you really probably have to do when writing sex scenes. So thank you all so much for participating, and thank you to Get Lit Festival for having us all. It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. It's been a
thank you.
pleasure and privilege to be here.
Yeah, thank you all. So thank you, Eliza, Ellen, Liv, Leah, Amanda. This was such a fun and empowering conversation. Clearly, this is a vulnerable topic, so I really appreciate all of you being so open about your processes and how different your perspectives and processes were. That was so great to hear. And I loved that it was a panel of all women talking about sex. I thought that was just fantastic. This is going to be a very helpful conversation, I think, for a lot of writers. So thanks again for sharing all of your insight and also sharing some of your writing with us. It was great to hear some excerpts as well. And thanks, Amanda, for submitting the idea for the event and moderating the conversation today. Thanks also to Luke, Get Lit's assistant coordinator, and our intern Sierra for helping out behind the scenes. And to everyone watching at home, I hope that you'll join us for more festival events, both in person and here on Zoom. Please visit our website, getlitfestival.org, for our full schedule and more information about all of our authors, including today's 5 talented writers. Thank you again for joining us today. Goodbye, everybody.